Hello everyone, welcome to my second video on nonlinear dynamics and the behavioral sciences. This video is going to be on understanding recurrence quantification analysis. We went over it a bit at the end of the first video, and we're going to dive a little deeper into it, understand what it means and what kind of inferences we can make from this type of analysis and from a recurrence quantification plot. Um, so just to get started here, this is where we left off in the last video with a basic plot here with time, 120 hours plotted on the x-axis and the wave height of a body of water on the y-axis. And at each red dot here is essentially where the wave, when the wave reached zero point 0.9 feet in height. Now, this is not an RQA plot. This is just to kind of give you an idea of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to show how, over a course of time, some certain state is revisited by the system, in this case, the zero point 0.9 feet. When we're going to do a recurrence quantification analysis, there's four major steps that we're going to have to take. First is going to be to collect some data. This can be discrete or continuous data. Ideally, the more observations you have, the better. Thousands typically would be the best. A couple hundred will typically be okay though. Then what we're going to do is you're going to want to project the system into multiple dimensions. So because these are complex phenomena with so many interacting parts, there's going to be multiple dimensions that exist within the system. But because we're only taking um, one measure, essentially, we can't account for all the multiple dimensions that truly exist within the system. However, Takens 1981 developed a technique to parse out additional dimensions from single dimensional data using what's called time delayed embedding. We won't go too much into that. We will discuss two parameters that you're going to need to set in order to make that happen, but we can parse out some of these dimensions and then we can plot them, and we can plot it as a recurrence quantification plot, which we'll show you in a moment. And then after that, we can go ahead and quantify some of the properties of the system based on the plot and make some inferences about the system and its behavior. So just to get back to what we're discussing with a time delayed embedding, to the decisions that you have to be making to determine this is how many dimensions are needed and what is the appropriate time lag. Those are the two parameters that you need to do it. So when we're doing time delayed embedding, we're essentially extracting singular dimensional data into multiple dimensions. And you can project multiple dimensions into a phase space like we have here. So this could be a time series and then projected into three dimensions. And what you're actually seeing here is how the system will essentially come down here and stay in this attractor state for a while, and then it'll pop up, go through this big quick transition, and then resume back to the attractor state. So you have the system that's kind of down here for long periods of time, goes back up here, goes back down. Um, that's a phase space. It's multidimensional. That's essentially a three-dimensional representation of what we're doing when we use time-delayed embedding to extract multiple dimensions from smaller dimensional data, is just, getting that kind of data out of it so we can see different types of states that the system likes to return to. Um, Moving on, a couple other parameters that we need to account for before we can do the recurrence plot is the recurrence threshold. This is not necessarily for discrete data, but for continuous data, i.e. time series, we have to set this threshold for recurrence, and that's because with the continuous data, it's not likely that the exact same point is going to be revisited over and over again. Um, so, depending on how many decimal points your measurement's at, it's going to be increasingly less likely that, if you're going 8 decimals deep, it's not likely to be reoccurred. So you can but if you set your threshold to maybe the 10th of a decimal, um, you can probably get that right. So think like a stock, for example. Do we want to set every time the stock gets to $10.11, or do we want to give it like a range, maybe like $9.80 to $10.40. So you have a little bit of a range there. Every time it gets to that point, we'll call it a reoccurrence. And the convention is essentially to make it such that 2 to 5% of the points on the plot are recurrences. So when you see the plot in a moment here, you understand what I'm saying and that's because if you do much more than that, you're just going to have a plot that's completely filled out and you're not going to be able to parse any information out of it. Whereas if it's too small, it's just going to be empty. So here is an example of RQA plot, and you can see what I was talking about by if it was, this is one that's about between 2 to 5%. It's pretty sparse. If it were in the 80%, this would all just be black and you would just have some small white spots intertwined in between. So that's why you want to set that recurrence rate so that it's about like this. Um, and what you're looking at here is you have the same dimension, or the same, it can be any property time, specific, usually if you're doing time series, is going to be on both dimensions, so it's a symmetrical plot. And every time there's a dot, that means that there is a recurrence here. So whenever whatever the threshold for recurrence here is, here at around 45, well that whatever that level was, it was hit at 35, but it was also hit at the same threshold was also hit at around what would that be? Maybe about 15. And same thing for everything else here. And then again, like I said, these are symmetrical, so the bottom half is identical to that. It's just mirroring the top half. So that's essentially what the RQA plot is showing us, but there's several things that we can infer from this plot, and that's listed here on the left. And the first one is the recurrence rate, and this is kind of the intensity at which the system returns to uh, previous states. Um, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Recurrence rate, the rate at which a certain value reoccurs in the plot. Um, and those can be, and those are going to be the dots, obviously. The second one is determinism. So determinism can be seen by these little lines, and that is going to kind of be like a measure of predictability within the system. So these long lines here kind of suggest that the system is going to return to the state, and that if it does return to a state, it might stay in that state for a long period of time. The third one is line length and line average length and average or total range. So, like what is the average line length is going to tell us, what is the average, basically determinism of the state. What is it the most likely time that if the system returns to a specific state, how long is it going to be there? And the range is going to tell us what is the lowest amount of time it return to that state and what is the highest amount of time that return to that state. And here you have example of a pretty large one and a smaller one here. And the fourth and last one is entropy. This is measured in terms of Shannon information entropy and measures the complexity of the system. And what it takes into consideration is the range, small, medium, larger, another set of like two small ones here. The lengths of the system, the range, the variance of the different lines, the diagonal lines that we see here, how many there are and how variant they are in terms of their length, but also how many different length ones there are. And the more variance in both length and variety of length, um, the higher the complexity of the system. So that is the basics of RQA. There are additional properties that can be inferred and quantified from these plots, but these are the main ones that are typically used and referenced most in the literature that I've encountered. And I've cited all the sources are going to be linked into the video description below. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and get into coding and modeling this in R. There's some pretty cool packages that allow us to import any time series data and actually do recurrence quantification analysis. And there's packages to plot the RQA plots that we see here. And we're going to go ahead and do all that. And that way, if you have a situation where you were needing to analyze some time series data and you want to plot it and do the analysis, you'll be ready to go. And that's it. Thank you.